This is Boston Lanka's special series on upcoming presidential elections in Sri Lanka. I am Chitral Dimer. Professor Rajiva Wijesinha, who is considered as one of the few intellectuals in the ruling party, left the government and joined with the common candidate Maithripala Sirisena. We now join with Professor Rajiva Wijesinha. Professor Wijesinha, you have been one ruling party politician who was defending the government in the international media for all these times. I mean, at least till last month. So what made you decide to leave the government and to support the common candidate, Maithripala Sirisena?
Well, over the last year, I've been trying to point out to the President certain areas in which reforms seemed essential. And my party, the Liberal Party, actually wrote to him in October, saying that we didn't think it would be proper to have an election so soon. You had 2 years more of his term remained. And we told him to please implement the various reforms that had been pledged in his manifesto, some of which, of course, were of particular interest to us, like educational and higher educational reform, then changes to the Local Government Act, some of which I had been helping the Secretary and the Minister with drafting, electoral reform, and, of course, most important of all, the national question. And we just didn't get a reply. Our letter was acknowledged. But we had told him that if there were no reforms, we would find it difficult to support him. I think we might have found it difficult to support the person who seemed then to be the likely candidate, Mr. Vikramasinghe of the UNP, because we felt that while, he had perhaps negotiated in good faith with the LTT, they had run circles around him. And they had not been able to really take action. And we certainly stand by our decision to have supported President Rajapaksa in his efforts to stop terrorism. And in fact, I continue to defend the efforts of both the President and the military. There was an interview on Al Jazeera in which I was very, very firm with the GTF person, and said, this was all nonsense, the allegations he was making, and both he and the Al Jazeera anchor tried to interrupt me. And one of them said, there was a UN report, and I said, I'm not concerned about the prejudices of the, UN reports. I believe that by and large we fought a very, very good war. Now, it saddens me that perhaps one allegation made against this government, that they are selling the war to win elections, seems perhaps accurate, because President Rajapaksa announced publicly that I had actually agreed with Surendran. In fact, when I said contrary to Mr. Surendran, I said it very clearly, and I rejected many of his ideas. But I think the President seems anxious to do anything possible to, win the election. And I think that is sad. In fact, my friend Dayanjalika had told him afterwards, that was wrong. And he had admitted this, but he seems to have this tendency to claim that everyone who criticizes him is conspiratorial. He had done this to Dayan. Dayan had actually been very negative about what happened at Valley when the forces opened fire on some demonstrators and some people died. And both Dayan and I signed a petition. And, Gotabaya Rajapaksa called me up and said, why are you signing petitions with enemies of the people? And I said, they're not enemies of the people. People like Dayan and Tamara and I had defended the country and the government. But what happened was wrong, I said. People should not be fired on. And, Gotabaya agreed with me. He said, yes, that's why I'm having an inquiry. And I said, well, I think we should all protest. You can't have a polarization where people who are in favor of the government therefore condone what is wrong. And I was immensely saddened that the President, seemed to want to win electoral points by attacking me. And I would go further. I would say that, frankly, there seem to be people around the President who don't want those false allegations rejected. Both Dan and I think, did very well internationally in pointing out what were false. And then after our services were in a sense dispensed with. And that time felt the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the President told me he panics when he sees another professor, so he feels jealous, that's not my problem. But Chris Nonis, who then became the first person after us to deal very firmly with allegations by the international media and had an excellent interview on CNN. He was beaten up by Sajin and in fact, driven to resignation. And it seems as though, as has been happening in Geneva in the last 3 years, there seems to be no care on the part of government for the fact that we're losing internationally. We have a very good record in the war that can easily be defended, and no one is defending it. And I find that unacceptable.
How is election campaign of Maithripala Sirisena? You think you have the momentum?
Oh, yes, very much so. When he became the common candidate, and I was delighted, for months I had been telling Mahinda Rajapaksa that he should be working with what I call the genuine SLFP. He had been neglecting them. Many of them had kept telling me how upset they were. 2 days before the election was announced, Maithripala told me when I asked him what was happening. He said, and he was really deeply upset. And I felt people like Maithripala, Social President and Maithripala Sirisena should have been much more in the confidence of the president. But he was ignoring them. And I told him that, he should go ahead with some of his promises on 13, when he said 13 plus. He said, you don't know, they won't support me. And I said, the SLF is a moderate party, they will support you. And he said, and sadly, I realized there were people close to him who were spreading this type of, suspicion. Shenuka Senratne, his foreign secretary, went up to him after the first Geneva loss in 2012, for which I think she and the people she was working with at the time were partly responsible, and had told the president, the Indian Mr. Swaraj, who is now the Indian foreign minister, had been bad-mouthing him, together with Maithripala de Silva. And the president was so angry, like Veerasimha told me, that he actually wanted to reject Sushma Swaraj's visit. And Lalit actually, managed to, as he put it to me, shape it, because he got both GL and Basil Rajapaksa to tell the president nothing of the sort had happened. But I told Lalit, you haven't shaped it, you managed to have the meeting. So Sushma Swaraj, who was very positive about Sri Lanka, met the president and they got on well. But why didn't you think about why this had happened? Why didn't you try to find out who had misled the president? And when I told him, Lalit said, I said, I think Shenuka and both Sajin can't be trusted. And Lalit told me, well, you may be right about Shenuka. He defended Sajin and said he thought Sajin was a loyal supporter of the president. But he also had no illusions about Shenuka. So this attempt to alienate him from the SLFP is going on a long way, and many SLFPers feel it. So when Maithripala came over, I think it was a great sense of relief on the part of a lot of people who, wanted a strong opposition candidate. And although initially, because there were lots of parties, many people had many different ideas, I think they've come together very well. The manifesto has now come out. The translation should be out soon. And the election campaign is going very well indeed. And many people from all parties are doing their best because they realize that democracy needs their support.
Let's talk about the Ambassador Chris Nonis and the incident that happened in New York that led him to resign. You seem to have got a lot of inside information about that incident that happened in New York.
Well, I met Chris Nonis. When I was in England, I saw him. The man was really quite nervous. I mean, he'd been obviously traumatized because you don't expect such a thing to happen. And he gave me several facts that squared with what I had been told here as well. For instance, Chris had been beaten up by Sajin. There had been an attempt to insult him the previous day at a public restaurant. But, Chris is an able chap, he had turned it aside. And then Sajin was supposed, according to a report in a website here, it's a website opposed to the president, so I can't say it's 100% accurate. But they cited him as saying, this man was getting too much. He wasn't under my control. And Shenuka and I decided to get rid of him. But two very salient features that Chris told me. One is that a lot of, let's say, harassment had begun after the Chogam meeting, in which Chris did very well. As you're probably aware, for instance, Prince Charles came here. Prince Charles had not wanted to see the president initially. He was going to the British High Commission and see him only at the end. And Chris had persuaded him to go and see the president on his first day. And, they shared cake with the president's birthday. And, Chris said he wasn't even asked for that event. And GL and Sajin, I think, were cutting him out. Then after the CNN interview, he said they began to persecute him and say, why are you coming to Colombo? You have no business to come to Colombo. And Chris said, the president told me, Chris was asked to be High Commissioner. He had said, I have to come for board meetings. The president had told him, and Chris paid for this himself. But this was not questioned for 2 years. Then people started saying, you can't do this, you can't come. GL started criticizing him. Chris said it on one occasion when the president asked him into temple trees. GL had just been saying, why haven't you gone back home? And Chris said when he was there, the president turned to GL and said, here's the man you tried to send back or something, and had basically put GL down. So I think the president was very happy. And then more recently, as you know, Chris was asked to speak at the defense seminar. And, Gotabed had always had a tradition of having civilians. I was asked to make a keynote speech 2 years running. And indeed, I, appreciated that opportunity. But then after I signed the petition about Valley Way, they stopped asking me. In fact, I was due to speak at the KDU. I asked them, has the Defense Secretary put me on the blacklist? And they sort of, indicated that was the case. And then more recently, about 2 months ago, when I was asked again to speak there, I said, has the blacklist been cleared? And they giggled, but I couldn't do that because I was going abroad. But the Secretary of Defense, who recognized talent, had invited Chris to speak. And he said after he was harassed even more, he was basically almost asked to show cause why he'd come. And Chris said he called the president, who said, "Kya monkey wo kiya?" And Chris told me he wrote in a letter saying, he had arranged this with the president. And I think they were very angry about that. But Chris then told me Sajin had wanted to see him in London. And I told him there was a lot of fuss being created. And Sajin had said, why don't you, keep us informed? Always tell me when you go to Colombo. So Chris said, I have no objection. I'll keep you informed completely. But, it was agreed that I should go regularly. And, it was after that happened that I think Chris and Shanmugam obviously decided to attack him. But I think the interesting thing is, while I think, jealousy explains both GLP risk and Sajin, because they don't like a man of talent who was doing so well, both for the forces, for the president and for the country. I think you have to go a bit deeper into Shanmugam Senratna's motives in a context in which, partly because of her manipulation, Tumara Kunnam had described it. We are now a pariah state internationally. We keep losing votes that Banjat was able to win so easily in the past. And I can't help feeling that there's something very strange about the conduct of this lady, particularly in the context of the audit report. The president had sent out auditors to check on something she'd done, and they had talked about LTT contacts, but that report also has been suppressed. So I'm really quite worried about what will happen to the country and our forces if the president wins and continues to work with, people like these, I would say, either incompetent or rather nasty people.
Now, you have mentioned in a newspaper article about a Portuguese connection that MP Sajin was trying to use in provoking Ambassador Chris Nonis. What is that all about?
Well, this is again something very interesting. Chris mentioned this to me, that Sajin had, made derogatory remarks about the Portuguese, and also, sort of mocked at the fact that Chris was a Catholic. And Sajin had confirmed this Portuguese thing. He didn't mention the Catholic thing in his interview, in his discussion with his friend in Colombo. But why I find that also very worrying is that 3 months ago, when the incidents happened at Aludgama, I was away when the president came back, so about a week or two later, I called him and I said, I felt this was wrong, that the Maithripala Sirisena had been behaving appallingly. And to my relief, the president agreed with me and said, Muslim and he claimed that this was because they were sponsored by the Americans and the Norwegians. And although I don't think he was correct, I said, even if you're correct, why does Gotabed fall into all their traps? And he then said, no, Gotabed didn't really go. And when I told him to go, and I said, that's not what he said or the BBS says. And the president said, and I said, no, I'm quoting from what they said. Just as, our Muslim members, Faisal Mustafa had said, don't have this meeting. President said, so I checked with Faisal, and Faisal said he had appealed to the government not to allow that meeting to happen because he knew what was going to happen. Then the president changed the subject and said, Mokatuna, you'll see what will happen. They will now set me against the Catholics. Now, what I find astonishing is that when there was a denigration of Catholics, the president turned on Chris. Gunasekara told me that, the president didn't accept Chris's resignation for about a week. In fact, he tried to hide the whole thing and didn't allow it to be played in the press, and it only broke in England. But then, suddenly you said one morning he had called up Chris and shouted him, and you said in language he had never heard him use before. And it had been about what the cardinal had said. And then Chris told me in England that the cardinal had called him, because Chris had been an absolute gentleman and not told anybody. And then, when it broke and the cardinal had called Chris, Chris had told him the whole story. And the cardinal had apparently called the president and said, please don't take people like Sajin who was going to want them to see the Pope. And apparently the president had exploded at this and accused Chris. He had sort of accused Chris of being a conspirator to destroy his chances of re-election. And I mean, this is sheer paranoia. But the point is here, instead of checking why Sajin Vaas had been attacking Catholics, he attacks Chris. And this is the whole problem with what has happened to the president now, that when people sort of tell him and all sorts of stories about people telling him that things are going bad, then he loses his temper. Then he apologizes. Recently I told some people, I talk like that. But you can't have a president who has lost his cool so badly.
Professor Wijesinha, let me ask this very bluntly. Who is really running the External Affairs Ministry in Sri Lanka? Is it Professor G.L. Pires or MP Sajin Vaas?
And I think this is of a piece with certainly some people who are strong supporters of the president. I mean, I tweeted this on Facebook today. There's a couple of people called Shenali Waduge and Senaka Viratna, one of whom work for me at the Peace Secretariat, who are, nationalists and fine, but they think attacking other people is the way to show you're a nationalist. And there's a vast attack now on Joseph Vaas, whom the Pope is coming to canonize. Senak had a line about how rich the Catholics in India and their next target may be Sri Lanka. And these are the people who are the favorites of, what I would call the extremist supporters of the president. And Shenali Waduge, for instance, had stuff attacking the Indians, which the Defense Ministry put on its website. And they had to withdraw when the Indians said, this is insulting. And then they said, no, we didn't, we shouldn't have gone up. But the cartoon that accompanied that, which was insulting, was put up by the ministry, not by Shenali Waduge. So there seems to be a group of people around the president who are sort of going for broke, want to turn Sri Lanka into this isolated state where, their powers are going to be absolute and there's no alternative. And I think this effort to create religious schism on top of the BBS is symptomatic of the rot that has set in.
What do you think need to be done differently in foreign service and in foreign policy under a Maithripala regime if he wins the election?
Well, it's been indicated in the longer version of the manifesto. And on foreign policy, we have said, and some of these have been incorporated in the Maitri agenda, that, we should have a clear policy. We need to recognize the centrality of India while obviously not allowing ourselves to be dictated to with regard to domestic policy, but with regard to international relations. This is our biggest neighbor. And every sane country in the world, if they have a large neighbor, they make sure that relations are good. Then we talked about the need to professionalize the service. I have actually said that while in certain cases, you get people from outside the career service to be ambassadors. Some of the best ambassadors never come from Ratnashali embassy from outside. What has really destroyed the service, which began under Jayajawat, and Mahinda Rajapaksa has just taken it to fine art, is just putting in friends, relations, hangers on into other positions as well. And, it's our career diplomats who suffer. Two of our ambassadors, Ranjit Gunratne in Lebanon and Shaf in Oman, have actually been, their terms have been cut short because they tried to take action against abusers of our migrant workers. And there's sort of corrupt element, both in the Foreign Ministry and in the Bureau of Foreign Employment, who have really destroyed anyone who tried to bring some sanity and justice into this. Asita Pereira, my friend who was ambassador in Rome, was sacked because he tried to put a stop to a racket. And indeed, some of the Italian friends in the diplomatic service told me, not people here, because they've been diplomatic, but some abroad who knew the situation, that Asita had tried to stop this practice of people in the foreign ministry just signing for visas for people. I mean, these included Neomal Pareda, the deputy minister. Now, I don't think Neomal was making money, but Neomal is such a, innocuous man. Someone put something in front of him and said, sign, he'd sign. And they found people were being, visas were got, the chief protocol was involved. And when Asita tried to deal with this, he was sacked. And the poor man actually died because, it was a terrific insult for someone who had done his best. And, his efforts to deal with this had led to the president sort of saying, you're my ambassador. The ambassadors are called back for the election. And Asita, the last time, because this time he's not here with us, but last time he was in Korea and he had some work. And he said, Tamase patkale mama, man kiyanකොට enna. This is not the way to run a country.
Now, many ruling party politicians, such as Minister Vimal Veeravansa and even President Rajapaksa, keep saying that there is a foreign conspiracy and also accuse some Western embassies that they are pumping money to the common candidates' campaign. What do you have to say to those accusations?
Okay, now I think when the president talks of a conspiracy, the president is the person who decided to have an election now. No one else wanted this election. I told you, Maithripala was deeply upset. We wrote to him and told him not to. I mean, he has 2 years of his term. You see, but the president, when I told him about reforms, he said, but this happens once a year. The president has got it into his head that he's been elected president in order to have elections all the time. He has not realized that the elections are held to choose a president to rule the country. But, as I said somewhere, we told this might have annoyed him. But those who are minting money through the corruption, who are throwing their weight about, they use him as a sort of cash cow. He's not allowed to take decisions. What he says is ignored. Then they let him out every few months to run for election. And because he's the only popular person of them, none of the others of that lot would win a vote if he weren't there. They bring him out to run for elections, and then the minute he wins the election, they take over again. But he's got to realize that the president must run the country. He must implement his promises. He's the person who had this election now. Certainly, as far as I know, the foreign ambassadors were really surprised when Maithripala came out. Some of them had sort of indicated to me before that they had assumed Ranil would be the candidate. I think that was really what the president had been assuming, because they had printed enormous amounts of posters to attack Ranil. And, I can only think that many sensible people in the forces are not telling the president what the intelligence services have found out, because they realize what a disaster third term for Mahinda Rajapaksa would be for our forces, for the country, and the whole international image. So I think the conspiracy is something the president has been engineering and those around him, saying, Api Jagrananga Katakala dinanna puluwan, Ranil hitiyot lesing dinanna puluwan. And they were trying to fight this election on what I would call the pitch of the LTT, and are totally thrown when they find a totally different pitch, which is about the present and the future, not about the past, which is all the president can talk of.